Hello everybody, I'm starting today's video off with the voiceover, which is never a good sign, but I'd just like to say there are a lot of things wrong with this video. My cupboard door's open, which is a bit of a trademark of the channel. Luke's half cut out of the frame the entire time. There's a whole lot of things wrong, but it's our first video back in a while. So we did as good as we could. Another thing, we speak unbelievably quickly in this video, and there's a lot of content. So don't be worried if you have to watch it in 0.5 times speed. But if people want a copy of the script or need a copy of the script just so that they can make sure they get this information down, let us know, and we'll make sure that's possible, because we're just trying to help, and sometimes it's a bit hard to actually work out what we're saying when we speak that quickly. So if anybody needs any more help or a copy of the script, just let us know, and we'd be happy to help. All right, over to me to do the actual intro. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another Bentley Davey Tutors video. It has been a while, evidently, but we needed the Duke of Ed hours, so we're back this week. There might be more videos coming. Yeah, we might get banned. Anyway, today we will be looking at the civil rights movement in Australia and the US. We're going to be taking a look at the UN as well, and the UDHR, as well as just the struggle for rights and freedoms generally in both of those countries. So if you would like a copy of the script, if you leave a comment and a like on the video, and if you're subscribed, we will be sure to send you the script. That is if you actually want it. If you don't want it, but you still want to leave a comment and you want to like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated as well.
And if obviously, they don't want to do any of those.
Yeah, if you don't want to do any of those, that's fine too, but it would not be greatly appreciated. The Duke of Ed hours are based on how many subscribers we get, so we really need, please subscribe. But anyway,
just one more.
Yeah, just one more and we're done. All right, so let's get started. So firstly, we're going to be looking at the origins and significance of the United Nations and also the UDHR. So firstly, the origins of the UN and its role. So the role of the UN is to preserve international peace and security, and it acts as a body to oversee the international community and uphold international standards. And it was born out of the horrors of World War II, as the international community sought to never experience that sort of horrific war again. The other goals of the UN have been to improve standards of living globally and improve the rights and freedoms of everybody around the world.
Yep, so now I'll move on to looking at the significance of the role of Australia in the UN and also Doc Evatt. So Australia was one of the original 51 ratifying members to the UN Charter, which was crucial in helping to establish it. Australia acted as a member of the 18-nation body who drafted the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Australia's Dr. Herbert Evatt was a member of the Australian delegation at the UN. Doc Evatt has served as a High Court Justice, the Attorney General, and as the leader of the Labor Party before attending the UN as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Doc was crucial in the drafting of the UN, and 20 out of the 38 articles he submitted were included in the final charter, in whole or in part, including the right to rest and leisure and the right to own property.
Absolutely. In terms of the significance of the UDHR, which, as we mentioned, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the UDHR is a declaration of human rights that is set out in a charter. And it consists of a preamble, which is just a little bit at the start, and then 30 rights. The rights are set up in two different sections, these being civil and political rights, and social, cultural, and economic rights. As a general rule, the civil and political rights are at the front, and the social, cultural, and political...
Take your time.
Hang on. And the social, cultural, and economic rights are towards the end. These rights have four characteristics which are incredibly important. So this is all of the rights in the UDHR. So they are, firstly, inherent, which means that they automatically apply to all humans at birth. You don't have to do anything to get them, and there is no qualifications for human rights. Secondly, they are universal, which means that they apply to everybody, no matter their race, religion, gender, or any other factor. Thirdly, they are inalienable, which means that they cannot be taken away from an individual under any circumstances. And then finally, they are indivisible and independent. So that means that rights cannot be split up. You can't give somebody half a right, but not the whole right. And also, rights cannot be picked and chosen. Further, their interdependence means that that for one right to be upheld, other rights have to be upheld as well.
So now we'll move on to a whole new section, being the background to the struggle for rights and freedoms before 1965. So firstly, we'll do an introduction to the policies of protectionism, assimilation, integration, and self-determination. So we'll start with protectionism. This was between a policy from 1869 all the way to 1937, and the idea of this policy was that Indigenous people would eventually die out due to the devastating impact of settlement. The policy aimed to make Indigenous Australians dependent on the Europeans. The effect of this policy was essentially the lack of all rights for Indigenous people. They couldn't own land, they got no pay, had their education levels dramatically reduced, and were required to ask permission before marrying or leaving a certain area. So next we've got assimilation, and this was from 1937 to 1965. This was implemented to encourage Indigenous Australians to join in with the European way of life. This policy encouraged giving certification. Good spelling. This policy encouraged giving certification, known colloquially as dog licenses, to Indigenous Australians who had successfully assimilated, and the policy stimulated the introduction of the stolen generations to try and assimilate more mixed blood children. This also perpetuated. Yeah. This also perpetuated. This also perpetuated existing issues with the lack of welfare, quality of education, and pay still existing. Thirdly, we've got integration. This was between the 1960s and 70s. This policy was formally introduced and adopted by the government in 1965 as an acknowledgement that assimilation had failed and different steps needed to be taken to address issues present. This encompassed the 1967 referendum. The constitutional change in 1967 allowed for Indigenous Australians to be counted in the census, and for the first time gave the Commonwealth Government the power to make laws for Indigenous people, and this was previously the power held only by states. And finally, we've got self-determination and reconciliation, and this is from 1972 onwards. This policy was implemented as a response to ending paternalistic attitudes in place until that time, and involved providing Indigenous Australians a voice to speak out against wrongdoing. This allowed Indigenous Australians to take on positions of leadership and responsibility, as well as enforcing a policy of equal rights through the repeal of discriminatory practices. The self-determination aspect was accompanied by reconciliation and moved for mutual respect, acceptance of suffering, and the acknowledgement of past wrongdoings by European Australians.
Yes, so the next thing we're going to look at is the purpose and significance of early Indigenous activism. So early Indigenous activism was spearheaded by two main Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups called the AAL, or the Australian Aborigines League, and the APA, which was the Aborigines Progressive Association. These groups essentially dominated the early activism landscape, and this early activism led to a number of demands for Indigenous Australians, including wanting to be taught to live in the modern age and to not be studied or preserved like fauna. They also requested equal education, equal opportunity, wages, rights, and property rights, essentially equal citizenship. They wanted a fair deal.
So now we move on to the Day of Mourning in 1938. So a bit of background. This was supposed to be a major celebration planned for Australia Day, which included a reenactment of the first fleet arriving, which included 25 Aboriginal men who were used against their will. This fueled already growing anger at the treatment of Indigenous people, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups decided to host the National Day of Mourning in protest. On the day, Aborigine leaders from New South Wales and Victoria marched through the streets in black clothing. They were denied entry to the town hall for their meetings, so instead marched to Australia Hall. They were then denied access to there as well through the front door, and so had to enter through the back. Once inside, a manifesto was distributed highlighting the abuses of Indigenous Australians. One of the leaders of the group, Jack Patton, became a big part of the day and gave a strong speech from the manifesto. In terms of outcomes and significance, it didn't put an end to the planned Oz Day celebrations, but it was symbolic as one of the first planned and organised meetings of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders to discuss civil rights. It attracted the attention of the Prime Minister, who met with the leaders to discuss the civil rights issues, and this led to the implementation of NAIDOC, and some Christian leaders began knowing the day before Australia Day as Aboriginal Sunday.
Yeah, so next we're going to look at the stolen generations. So we're going to look at the government policy, institutions in place, the impact and the experiences of people in the stolen generations. Obviously, as most of what we've covered in this video, this is just an incredibly short sort of snippet of what could be covered here. We could make entire videos on any one of these segments. So just quickly on the stolen generations. The stolen generation is one of the darkest parts of Australia's history, involving Indigenous Australians losing links with their family and with their land. they also lost understanding of the notion of kingship and missing out on being educated in their culture with their traditional values. This occurred to over 100,000 Aboriginal people by the 1980s. So the Stolen Generation was a systematic process enacted by state governments who established protection acts, allowing them to make these laws, established protection boards to administer the policies, gave power to police and protection officers to implement the policy, and took away the parents' responsibility of as the legal guardian of their children. So the policies were enforced throughout the 19th and much of the 20th century. And essentially, the policy was that Aboriginal children would be taken away from their homes and from their families, and they would be taken to institutions such as domestic training homes and remote farms in rural parts of Australia, often called missions. From the 1950s, however, there was an increase in children being sent to foster homes as a cost-saving method. So there were a range of severe impacts, which included families and communities being unable to share culture, poor health, education and work opportunities, high chance of imprisonment for these children, unemployment in the form of labour and domestic servant jobs from teenage years.
So now we move on to another new section looking at a few of the key events in the US civil rights movement. Firstly, Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation, largely in the southern states of the US. Beginning as early as 1865, these laws restricted African Americans in terms of where they could work and how much money they could make. Furthermore, it took away many essential rights for African Americans, such as the right to vote, to control where they lived and travelled, and also allowed for the children to be taken away for labour purposes. These laws and values extended to the legal system as well, with former Confederate soldiers working as police and judges, taking away any chance for African Americans to have a fair trial.
Our next thing today is the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and so the Montgomery Bus Boycott was a political and social protest campaign against the policy of racial segregation in the public transport system in Montgomery, Alabama. This was regarded as the first large-scale US demonstration against segregation, and it was sparked when Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, was fined and arrested for not giving up her seat to a white man on a bus. The US Supreme Court eventually ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus system and stop the policy of segregation on these buses.
Next, we move on to the Freedom Riders. So the Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into segregated states in the southern part of the US. The goal of these rides was to make sure their rights to unsegregated interstate travel were protected. Essentially, it was illegal to have any interstate buses or services associated with them, like restaurants and waiting rooms, to be segregated. The Freedom Riders were purely fulfilling their rights to make sure these services weren't segregated. They took a journey to the deep south of the US to try and see if these services purely were in segregated states, but they were not. The group were repeatedly attacked and at some point were left by their police escorts to be attacked by angry mobs.
Yeah. Our next point here is on Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King was an American Baptist minister and activist who also became the most visible spokesperson and leader among the American civil rights movement. He was a very influential player in the civil rights movement, being the driving force behind many events such as the Montgomery Bus Boycott and the 1963 March on Washington. In all of his events, he was known for always protesting peacefully. However, he was eventually assassinated in 1968.
And finally in this section, the protest marches, or the March on Washington. So the March on Washington was a large protest that occurred in August 1963, with over 250,000 people gathering in front of the Lincoln Memorial. The event aimed to raise awareness about continuing challenges and inequalities faced by African Americans a century after emancipation. It was also the protest where Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech was said. So yeah, these are just some brief overviews of these major events. So if any catch your eye and you feel like you could write really well about them, definitely go do your own research to get a bit of a better knowledge of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're now going to look at the struggle for rights and freedoms in Australia after 1965. And the key point to make here, just before we go into that, is that many of the events, as we'll see, in the Australian struggle for civil rights, are heavily influenced by those same events that occurred in the US. So as I'm about to speak about, we have the Australian freedom rides, which were essentially based off the US freedom rides, had a slightly different message. Instead of focusing on interstate segregation in interstate buses, this was more focused on general segregation all around Australia. So let's speak about Charlie Perkins and the freedom rides. So this was a 16-day bus journey, which was Highly influenced, as I said, by the US freedom rides. So students from the University of Sydney, led by Charlie Perkins, were led by Charlie Perkins through regional New South Wales. So the group moved from city to city with the goal of desegregating public areas, as well as being adamant on the improvement of rights and freedoms for Indigenous Australians. So this included the desegregation of RSL clubs, most famously in Walgett, and public swimming pools for children, which was most famously done in Mourning.
So now onto the 1967 referendum. Australians were voting yes for a change to the constitution so that discriminatory sections were removed and that the federal government had the power to make laws for Aboriginal people which could override discriminatory laws made within individual states. These parts of the constitution were sections 51A and 127. The change of clause 51 was that states could no longer treat Aboriginal people at a lower standard than any other citizen, as the federal government now had the power to override these discriminatory laws. The impact of changing section 127 is that the Aboriginal people were now counted among the population in the census, and data was taken about all citizens, including them. The result of the referendum was a resounding yes to these changes. While the change in constitution made no reference to voting rights, the fact that Aboriginal people had been given the same rights as all citizens within states meant that individual states had to provide voting rights.
Yeah. Hi everyone, it's me again with another voiceover. We're here for this one just because it's the middle of the video. You're just about at the halfway point. I hope you've enjoyed it too so far, and it hasn't been too hard to get the information into your brain. But we just thought we'd provide you a nice little break in the middle. You'll see in the next couple of clips, Luke appears to be on his phone, and that's because he got very bored of me talking and decided to play Candy Crush. But he also happened to screen record his game, so he told me that he really wanted you all to see that he beat the first level so quickly. So I'm going to put in a quick clip here just to let you have some time to regroup and regather your thoughts. And yeah, you can watch Luke apparently be good at Candy Crush. I don't know though, seems like a bit of a waste of time. Okay, so I had a look at this section again, and it seemed a bit boring, so I've decided I'm going to commentate. Not really sure, but I'm not an expert Candy Crush player, but gee, that looked good. That got a lot of things. Oh, tasty. Oh, and another one. Look at all those lines. Gee, now down to 31 moves, only 15 little squares left. Oh, 14 now. Okay, a bit of a weaker move there. That was nice. Got 2 more of the little squares. Nice. Another 3, down to 9 now, and 8. Gee, he does seem to be quite good at this game. He told me he was, but I didn't believe him. Let's see what's going on here. He's only 4 squares left. Delicious. Right. 3, 2, 1. He's done it. He did say he got it straight away. Okay, all right. Full credit to him there. That was a really strong effort. I'd say what I was talking about was more important, but I mean, at least he did well. So now we'll pass back over to me for the actual video. There's another about 1.5 minutes of this, but I'm gonna save you the trouble. If this ever ends. Okay, it ended. Good. So the next thing that we have to look at today is the tent embassy. So this was essentially a form of protest where a large tent was set up out the front of Old Parliament House with a sign reading Aboriginal Embassy on the front. And the idea here was that Indigenous Australians felt like they needed an embassy in their own country. And as we all know, embassies are set up in foreign countries as essentially a body to represent people from a country in another country. So essentially Indigenous Australians felt that they needed to bring this in because they didn't feel at home or welcomed in their own country. So let's look at the aims here. So the main focus was on the government's land rights policies. This was instigated in response to a speech by the PM, essentially saying that there would be no land rights in Australia for a very long time. And the goals now included sovereignty and self-determination for Indigenous Australians. The tent embassy was also spurred on by 2 cases of land rights in the Northern Territory, this being the Wave Hill Walk-Off and a case involving the Yolngu people. The Yolngu people were not granted rights to their land. So this was also originally set up as Indigenous people felt like foreigners in their own country, and they felt like that they didn't have the rights to use the land that they rightfully owned. So in terms of the methods used, the main method was setting up a publicly irritating image for politicians who were often resistant to change. I mean, the idea was that to create an eyesore on parliamentary land, which also sent strong messages to politicians and the wider community. Further, organisers of the embassy organised protests and marches. Protest marches and talks with multiple politicians to try and force change. The embassy was also repeatedly put up and taken down, further emphasising the annoyance for politicians who often ordered police to go and take down the tents. And the idea here was to make sure that nobody could miss the issue that was present. So in terms of the outcome and significance, the tent embassy was significant because of the incredibly strong statement it made. The physical and legal change that came out of it is difficult to measure, but it sent a strong message to the government and the population that Indigenous issues in Australia could not be ignored. Further, the embassy was permanently erected and was placed on the register of the national estate, making its place as an important historical place. Finally, the embassy exists today as a place where Indigenous leaders from around the country come to meet and discuss and to solve issues that continue today. The embassy has continued to be a focal point for a number of protests and marches on Parliament, and the embassy in Canberra has encouraged and inspired similar smaller embassies to be constructed in most of Australia's other capital cities. The Sacred Fire for Peace and Justice has also been erected as part of the embassy and continues to be fueled by the guardians of the fire who live at the embassy today. The fire represents the ongoing struggle for peace and justice faced by Indigenous Australians, and this was the first time that the land rights flag, which is now known as the Indigenous flag, was flown in 1972. So those are the significant aspects of the Kent Embassy.
It's a good timing. So now we move on to the land rights. So firstly, here is an outline of two very significant events and people leading to land rights being granted to Aboriginal people. So firstly, the Wavehill Walk-Off. This protest, lasting from 1966 to 1975 by the Gurindji tribe, was a strike for better working and pay conditions on a cattle station owned by a British company. The strike soon grew to be about demanding the return on land they were working on, as it was the land of their people. Their land was returned to them by the Whitlam government in 1975. And secondly, the Mabo decision. This 1992 decision by the High Court acknowledged that Indigenous Australians were entitled to possession, occupation, enjoyment and use of particular traditional land based on a continual relationship with that land. It overturned the concept of terra nullius, and for the first time Australia recognised the legal existence of Indigenous Australians before European settlement.
So the next thing to look at today is the policy of reconciliation. So the policy of reconciliation is centred around an attempt to make all Australians understand that Indigenous people have suffered greatly through loss of land and general oppression for hundreds of years, and that there needs to be an apology made, and that Indigenous Australians need to be compensated for that suffering in an attempt to move past the issue. The government passed the Council for Reconciliation Act in 1991, which set up a 25-person council including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as well as representatives from the media, the unions, employers and major political parties. The goal was to make sure that all Australians had recognised that Indigenous people were the traditional owners of the land, and that they had suffered greatly due to it being taken away from them. Other NGOs such as Reconciliation Australia also exist to promote and facilitate the reconciliation process in Australia. So in terms of the Bringing Them Home report, the HREOC was the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, and in 1995 they began an inquest into the stolen generations, and in 1997 they delivered their Bringing Them Home report, which was tabled in Parliament on the 26th of May 1997. This paper essentially summarised the rationale for the policy as well as its immediate and lasting negative impacts. So what were the findings of this report? Well, they found that the policy of removal violated Australia's own legal system, our international human rights obligations, and a commonly held belief that children should grow up in their own families. It also found that it was found that the policy of the stolen generation was actually considered genocide by Article 1, Section D of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And finally, it was found that children were removed due to racist beliefs that Indigenous culture had nothing to offer children as they grew up. And it was also considered better to take these children out of substandard living conditions instead of actually improving said living conditions. That was the view presented at the time of the policy being implemented. So the recommendations from this report, the report recommended that the government, the police force and the churches do the following things. Formally apologise to the stolen generations, help Indigenous people reunite with their families, publicly recognise the past injustices through Education and National Sorry Day, and establish a national compensation fund. In terms of the responses to the report, in 1997, the government pledged $63 million to adopting HREOC's recommendations. However, it rejected the suggestion of a compensation fund. The apology that the government gave in 1999 was purely where the government were able to say that they regretted the policy of the stolen generation and the past injustices, but there was no formal apology until 9 years later.
So what that's referring to is the Kevin Rudd apology.
That's correct.
So Kevin Rudd apologised to three different peoples. Firstly, he apologised to those affected by the stolen generations and the families who were torn apart. Secondly, to those affected by laws, policies, to those affected by laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss, and finally for the inequality faced by First Nations people. In terms of policy, Kevin Rudd apologised for the assimilation policy, particularly the removal of children from their families during the stolen generation. Kevin Rudd apologised for the integration policy, which was quite meaningless as Aboriginal children continue to be taken from their families. Kevin Rudd also made reference to the Closing the Gap, a policy that would be introduced in the future to meet goals and strive for equality in living standards for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The hope for a future of reconciliation is that Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians turn this page together. Rudd hopes that the Reconciliation Day will transform the way the nation thinks about itself. He wants there to be a new beginning for Australia, one based on a new respect for all Australians.
Yeah, and Kevin Rudd interestingly delivered that apology on just his second day in office in 2008. So the next thing that we're going to look at is the 2007 intervention. So at this time, Indigenous Australians are consistently furthering their rights and freedoms. However, there are still significant gaps in the living standards, such as lower levels of opportunity and education when compared to other Australian groups. The intervention was a 2007 policy introduced by the Howard government, with the intention being that the government would intervene in these particular Indigenous affairs where Indigenous people were falling behind. The main idea of this legislation was to decrease the number of Indigenous Australian children suffering from abuse and violence. However, the methods used to achieve this were questionable and included things such as decreasing Indigenous people's control over their land, controlling how welfare payments were received, banning alcohol and pornography in communities, and increasing policing in the area. So there were many critics to this policy who argued that the government had failed to consult Indigenous communities about these rules, and the UN actually found that this policy was racially discriminatory, and many people who defended the policy claimed that it was helping children, but there was a lack of evidence that it actually did provide any benefits for children.
So now the 2007 UN Declaration. On the 13th of September 2007, the UN voted to introduce the Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, which set out the minimum standard for protecting Indigenous rights. This prohibited discrimination and encouraged Indigenous peoples rights to pursue their own visions of economic and social development. The vote was 143 in favour, 11 abstentions, and 4 votes of no, one of which was Australia. Australia voted no as the coalition government did not like the parts of the declaration referring to self-determination, upholding customary law, land rights, and intellectual and cultural property rights. 2 years later, the Rudd government officially supported the declaration.
And so the final area that we're going to look at today is the continuing nature of efforts to secure civil rights and freedoms for Indigenous Australians. So firstly, Adam Goodes. So Adam Goodes was a well-known AFL player who played for the Sydney Swans, and he won Australian of the Year in 2014. Goodes had a long and extensive AFL career, which sadly ended early with his retirement after years and years of racial abuse on and off the field. This was mainly sparked in a game against Collingwood, where a 13-year-old girl called him an ape after he scored a goal in that match. Essentially, Goodes was able to immediately point out the fan who was removed. Goodes later called the fan to have a conversation about what she had said and how much that had hurt him, but he was able to forgive this fan. But what he did identify out of that is that racism is still continuing to a high extent to this day, and a lot of that is because children aren't inherently racist, but a lot of the things that they hear from adults around them can influence how they think and speak. He found that obviously that girl wasn't meaning to be racist, but she had heard other members of the crowd say similar things about Goodes and thought that it was okay to repeat that. So Goodes' story and the lack of action by the AFL in order to step in and remove the racism as soon as they found out about it was one of the reasons why he had to quit the game of AFL, and it's a key image of how racism is still continuing to this day despite a major increase in the rights and freedoms for Indigenous people.
So now the final topic, which I'm sure you're all desperately waiting for, so you can click off the video. The final topic is constitutional recognition. So the Uluru Statement of the Heart was produced in 2017 by a group of Indigenous leaders from all across the country. The Labor and Liberal parties have both asked for this to be produced so they can have a better idea of what the needs of Indigenous Australians were at the time. The statement called for 2 things. Firstly, a First Nations voice in Parliament, and secondly, constitutional recognition. The Turnbull government in power at the time denied both of these requests. So yeah, that's all we've got for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed the what I assume is a very short video. Again, we're getting to that end of the year exam stage of our lives, so be expecting plenty more videos covering a range of topics. So make sure you like, comment, and yeah, just keep checking the channel every day for your daily fix of pen and paper tutors. Thank you.
Yeah, and if we haven't uploaded a new video every day, just go throwback, watch some of our previous ones.
Yeah, the rabbits one.
I'm sure.
Great one.
Rabbits one's a great video.
That's a good one.
Rabbits, I'd say actually that's a new initiative I'm going to bring in at the end of today's video for the 5 people who will still be watching. So we're going to go road to 10k on the rabbits video. I think we're almost at 10,000 views on that one. So if we can get to 10,000 views before the end of the month, I'd be over the moon.
You know what? Comment down below your rankings of your top 5 friendly days.
Yes, actually do that as well.
Let us know what you like.
Yeah. If you comment down below your ranking of the top 5 Bentley David Tutors videos, we will pin your comment.
And we'll send you the script.
And we'll send you the script. So yeah, we hope you loved today's video. It was great to make, and hopefully it was helpful. And as we always say, don't forget to do your own research. Thank you, and goodbye. All right, we did it. So this will be what, 30 seconds?